decided to, you know, go vegetarian. And then from there, we've been trying to go vegan, but the cheese thing is what gets me. Like I find alternatives, but the cheese thing, it gets me. Like, so I don't do any other dairy but cheese, and I'll still eat eggs. But that's what still gets me. But when we went on that journey, to become vegetarian and get off all the meats and everything like that, we decided to, hey, we want to start growing our own fruits and veggies, so we'll know where it's coming from, so it won't, you know, no chemicals, no anything like that. So we want to, you know, organic form, so we start buying more organically. And then I just this year purchased about an acre of land in North County, and I'm looking at a 30-acre plot on the back of, I don't know if you guys know where Sinks Road is. It's off of Lindbergh. But Sinks Road back in there, they have 30 acres, and we're looking to try to close on that sometime this year, so we can, you know, start farming. So that's what drew me.
That is awesome. Clap it up. Clap it up. That's always good to hear when you know, take your fate in your own hands, you make that decision, and you start taking the steps to get her done.
Yep.
So that's great. Just to finish up with the last few announcements before I introduce Jason Gerhardt, who's our speaker for today. Reminders, the photo waiver that I sent out, I only got about 2 or 3 of them back. So please, if you guys haven't signed those photo waivers and either initialed that you agree with allowing us to use your stories and your photos and give interviews, or that you would prefer to opt out, we need to know either way. So please send us those waivers back. Secondly, the Google group is active. I initially sent one through Earth Dance, but it would not allow many of you to accept those that request, because it was with an Earth Dance email. So I had to send it through my personal email. So if you received a second Google group invite from tiffany.coachb@gmail.com, same person, same purpose, please accept the invitation so you'll have access to all those documents that I've been sending out to you guys, including the waiver. And for those of you who could not open it because of the format, I will resend it in a different format so that you guys can print it out or convert it and return it. Lastly, I gotta do it. Payments for April, those of you who were on the payment plans, the April 17th payment date just passed. We understand everybody's going through different situations right now, so if you get those second payments in when you can, that'd be awesome, so that our accounting is legit, up to par. Sarati, is Sarati in the call? I do not see Sarati. She asked me to give her a brief introduction. I guess I can do that for her if she doesn't make it in the next couple of seconds. Sarati is our marketing and development manager, marketing and events manager. And she's the one who will also be reaching out to some of you in order to get some information with the projects that you're on, or any information pertaining to the stories or the photos that I mentioned that we need the waiver for. So she'll also be contacting you. She wanted to say hi and see some of you guys face to face, face to screen. so that you know who she was when she'd be contacting you. But I can continue to be the intermediary until that happens. If you want, oh, let me backtrack just a bit. I forgot to mention, some of you did request the PayPal for payments. That is an option. Just make sure you CC accounting at Earth Dance Farms so that we can get you an invoice to pay through PayPal as opposed to cash, check, money order, or other forms of payment. So if you'd like to pay digitally, that is an option. So I saw that Jason's in. So without further ado, today's speaker who's going to share with us some great information on water management. His name is Jason Gerhardt. He is the director of the Permaculture Institute Incorporated and the newly formed Mighty River Center. He's professionally practiced permaculture across the continent for over 15 years, and his work focuses on connecting to self, nature, and each other in his transformational work with gardens, farms, wildlands, and human communities. So without further ado, Jason Gerhardt, please give him a warm welcome. Warm welcome.
Virtual claps, yay.
Yeah, virtual clap.
Thank you, Tiffany. Hi, everybody, I'm Jason. I have a slideshow for you to basically go over some examples of what we're going to talk about. I think examples are essential in this case. So we'll have a lot of imagery, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can somebody give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen? Awesome. Okay. Is that full screen now? Great. Perfect. All right. So I am by profession anyway, a permaculture designer. And I do want to just describe a little bit, like, what does that mean? To me, permaculture is an aspiration. It's an aspiration of how are we going to last? How are we going to last together with each other, with the planet, and have more semblance of some permanence in human culture? Because a lot of times it feels like we could just descend into chaos at any moment. And we're sort of amidst one of those plunges right now, potentially. So it's an aspiration of lastingness in human culture on the planet, with each other. And design, specifically ecological design, is how we get there. So that's the medium that we use to actually attain more lastingness in human culture. And I will define design because I think this is critical. Design is just decision making and putting them into action, right? So how many of you made a decision and put it into action today? Yeah, we all did, right? We all got dressed, we all decided to eat something, we all, transported ourselves some way, virtually, hopefully. The idea is that we're all designers. We're all actually designing all of the time. And we're never actually taught about it. We're taught like reading, writing, arithmetic, and we're never actually taught how to make decisions. No wonder we have a lot of the conditions that we have on the earth, right? And in human communities. We're never taught about how to make better decisions. So to me, permaculture is the framework that I use that I discovered for myself that actually taught me that. And I feel so much passion for it that I can't help but share it every opportunity I get. So I'm really grateful to be here with you all today. This presentation is about water and how we last with that as an element, or within the context of water systems. And we don't often, it's sort of one of those things that we take for granted, that it's just always going to be there. It's flowing through the pipes, ready to turn on a tap, irrigate the garden, whatever the case may be. It's something we take for granted, and we should not take for granted, because water is being degraded greatly all over the planet. And I want to give you some context for our watershed, sort of the bigger macro watershed we're a part of, and the micro watershed that we're a part of. And talk a little bit about just sort of like what condition that's in, but also what we can do about it, and what different places around the country are doing about it. A lot of these slides, I'll just forewarn, are from the Desert Southwest, mostly because they have been leading in water management, basically because they have to, right? If you're in a dry climate, you just have to. That's a primary factor in your life and of community planning. So they've done a lot of work, and I'm going to share a lot of that. I spent 13 years between Arizona and Colorado doing this work in drylands and learning it, and eventually brought it back to St. Louis, where I'm born and raised. So let's dive in a little bit. The water cycle, we're all kind of taught this one from elementary school. Basically, is like water evaporates from the ocean, condenses as clouds in the atmosphere, gets heavy enough to where it forms precipitation, right? And then we're sort of also taught that it kind of neatly runs back off into the ocean, you know. All this other stuff in between is rarely talked about, but it is extremely critical to understanding the water cycle. And in particular, we're going to focus on infiltration. This little piece over here. If you can see can you see my mouse? I'm just looking for confirmation. Great. So I'm going to use that as a pointer. So infiltration is what we're really going to focus on. What happens to water when it infiltrates, or when we increase infiltration versus surface runoff. And I'll just say quickly, I'll be addressing this all throughout the presentation, but quickly, infiltrated water is what keeps rivers flowing. It's what keeps streams flowing. It's not overland flow, right? If you imagine we get a really heavy downpour for 24 hours, right? Like a torrential rainstorm. What happens? If you go to weather.gov, right, or any other weather site, you're going to see like there's a flash flood warning. There's this green band all around the Mississippi River, or the Missouri or the Merrimack. And it's that rainstorm that sort of, it acts as a pulse, right? So the water level kind of rises up and floods, or stays at that heightened water level, and then pretty quickly drops back down. Like in 2-3 days, it's back down to normal. So that can't be what keeps rivers flowing, right? It's actually infiltrated water that keeps them flowing, because we're not getting rain every single day or every other day to where the rivers are just draining surface runoff. It's infiltrated water forming seeps and springs that are often in the course of the river. They're actually in the water body itself. That's what keeps the river flowing. That's also what keeps pollution out of the rivers, right? If water's infiltrating through all these soil layers, it's actually it's like going through a carbon filter or a rock filter in some cases. It's containing pollutants and dealing with, and allowing the life in the soil to deal with them, to break them down mostly, especially in the case of nitrogen and petrochemical pollution. But we'll talk about that a little later. So just keep that in mind, that that's actually what we're aiming for, is to be better stewards of our water, to care better for our water system, to ensure that we have water, that our neighbors have water. We have to care for it. And to do that, increasing infiltration is really the most important step, and what a lot of the rest of this will be about. Before we get in too deep with what to do, I want to hit a few points of why are we even talking about this? So this represents water as a whole on the planet, and roughly 97% of all water on the planet is in the ocean. Okay, that's salt water. Really nice to swim in, great for the skin for, a little bit, and not really great for much else in terms of human uses. We can't irrigate with it because it's full of salt. Salt kills plants. We can't drink it. If you've ever been at the ocean and get like slapped by a wave and you take a mouthful of salt water, like it's so salty. It'd be hard to even add that much salt to a cup of water. So you can't drink it, can't use it in plumbing because it's corrosive to pipes. So basically salt water is just that. It's 97% of the water that we have on the planet is unusable, to us anyway. And then there's also salt lakes and there's salty groundwater. Groundwater referring to aquifers, stores of water underneath the ground. Leaving 2.5% of all water on the planet as fresh water, which is water that we can use. Of that 2.5%, almost 69% is locked up in ice caps and glaciers. Usually in person, somebody will sort of raise their hand at this moment and say, well, isn't that changing when the ice caps and glaciers are melting? And I say, yes, but they're melting into the ocean. So it's actually meaning this percentage is getting smaller and smaller. So of that 2.5%, 69% roughly is ice caps and glaciers. 30% is groundwater. It's water that's deep in the ground, typically, and therefore harder to access. You need an energy source or a windmill to pump it out. You got to pump it out somehow, which leaves of 2.5% of all water on the planet, that fresh water, only 1.3% of that is surface water, is water that we see, we have access to, that we directly impact. Seasonally, even 73% of that is locked up in ice and snow, and 20% is concentrated in specific areas around the world. And one of those areas is the Great Lakes in North America here, which is the largest freshwater storage on the planet. There's more fresh water there than any other place. And then you have, I need to move my screen for a second. Okay, there we go. Then you have soil moisture, swamps, wetlands, marshes, rivers, tiny percentage. Biological water is the water that's in us, in plants, in animals. And then there's water vapor or atmospheric water in the atmosphere, just water in vapor form. So why did I just go through all this? What's the point of all these numbers and percentages? The point is to say that this is an incredibly precious resource, and we need to figure out how to take better care of it because it's dwindling. A lot of wars around the world are actually fought over water. A lot of time we think they're about oil, but they're actually over water and who has access to it and who doesn't. And typically that leads to a lot of strife. So it'd be really wonderful to avoid all those things, honestly. And to do so, we have to sort of tap into water as this sort of essence of life and the thing that actually we all have in common. You know, like all of our bodies are more water than us, more than me elements, you know. And what's the human body as? Like 70 plus some percent of is water, right? So we're really just kind of like walking reservoirs, and not really doing a great job of treating that resource, or handling it or caring for it. For some reason, I can't change my slide. Let me try that. Okay, that'll work. This is our watershed here in the middle, which is the pink part. Okay, obviously it's a huge watershed. St. Louis is right here at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi. And half of the country basically drains through St. Louis. It's really a significant point in terms of hydrology. And if you zoom in a little closer, you see that we are in this Mississippi River basin. That is our watershed, our macro watershed. The Continental Divide here in Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, New Mexico separates that watershed, as do the Appalachian Mountains in the east. Zooming in even further, we're made up of sub-watersheds. So we have lots of micro watersheds. This is St. Louis City, the county's out here. And there's lots of different sort of sub-watersheds within our own municipalities even. I was looking at this earlier, sort of side note, maybe distraction here, but I liked this idea of, I looked at this earlier and I was thinking, maybe this is the best way to break up governance in this region where we have like hundreds of municipalities that are all sort of competing together and cooperating very, very inefficiently. That could be an interesting way to break it up. And there's been whole maps made actually of the country and how watersheds could have been the thing that we divided the country up and sort of created states out of based on natural geographic boundaries as determined by water. So I say, where's, all these slides have where from, where to. Where's our water coming from? Where's it going after it leaves us? And in what quality, right? Ideally, we're receiving water in a high quality so that we're not polluting ourselves through the thing that we consume more of than anything, right? We know we can go months without eating food. Like, that's very well documented. How many days can we go without water? It's 3 days, right? So 3 days is not very long. So we're consuming more water than we are anything. And a lot of our food is actually, most of the weight is just water. So it's the primary thing that makes up us and the thing that can ruin our health or improve our health. In what quality here in particular, because we're in this watershed, in the pink and red areas, this is what's called the Corn Belt, where most of the corn is grown in this country, at least the most productive corn ground in the country, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana predominantly, and bits and pieces in other states. Missouri has a fair amount as well, but heavily concentrated in these 3 states. Corn, if you've ever grown corn, right, in this climate, corn will get like 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall even, right? If you've grown it, you know that you only get 1 or 2 ears off of that plant. And it's that huge plant, 8 feet tall, with a stalk that's like a piece of bamboo, like you could use it as a walking stick almost. And then we take the cob, let's just say we get 1 cob and we take all the kernels off, we throw away the cob, we throw away the wrapper, right? All of that is just incidental biomass generated from the soil to produce those kernels of corn that we consume or that we feed to animals, which is the higher percentage of corn gets fed to animals as opposed to people. To produce all that biomass, you have to apply a ton of nitrogen, and it's literally tons. So globally, 80 million tons of nitrogen are applied to agricultural landscapes every single year, okay? 80 million tons. Of that, 17 million tons gets absorbed by plants. What happens with the other 63 million tons? It runs off. Okay, so it runs off the land into our waterways or into the groundwater, ultimately going down to the coastline where we have our estuaries and deltas. That's significant because aquatic systems are not able to deal with nitrogen. They're not able to deal with nutrients very well. It basically acts as a pollutant or a water degrading element. The soil is more than happy to deal with nitrogen, right? Plants just soak it up. It's food. A lot of us are, we have compost piles, or we're like generating fertility so that we can raise our food, right? Nitrogen is the most significant element involved in that. As the water gets to the deltas and the estuaries along the coastline, it leads to 2 conditions that are interrelated. One of them is hypoxic, which means oxygen depletion. So all the oxygen gets pulled out of the water. The other is eutrophic, which is nutrient laden or nutrient loading. That's largely nitrogen and phosphorus, the two main elements that our plants survive off of and that we try to generate as gardeners or farmers or producers of food. So all of this, all over the world, you can see we have excess nutrient runoff at coastal waterways and leading to hypoxic and eutrophic conditions. When you get nitrogen in the water sort of really quickly, you get a ton of algae, because the algae is basically the plant or the plant analog, the chlorophyll generating being that can soak up that nutrient, that can soak up phosphorus and nitrogen. And as the algae grows and grows and grows, it ends up sort of using up all of its resource base, and then it dies. As it dies, there's bacteria in the water that are aerobic, meaning they're pulling oxygen out of the water to break down all this decaying, dead algae biomass. And in so doing, you pull all the oxygen out of the water, you kill all the fish, right? And you kill a lot of the plants that are growing along the coastline, and you harm the spawning habitat, because fish all spawn along coastlines and estuaries where the water's warm and shallow and not deep and threatening, full of predators. And that leads to global impacts, right? And we're all a part of that, particularly because we live in the Mississippi River Basin. The Mississippi River Delta here is depicted. New Orleans is right here. This is Lake Pontchartrain. The Mississippi flows in. You can see the brown, it's depositing actual soil. Like, why are our rivers brown, right? Why is the Mississippi the muddy Mississippi? It's because it's carrying a ton of soil that's eroded from the land, and also nutrients down to the Gulf of Mexico, basically. Iowa loses, it's something like, I always forget this statistic. It's a lot higher than anyone would think. It's like 6 inches of soil across the entire state of Iowa is lost to erosion every single year. Okay, and where it ends up is down here. The green here is actually the algae bloom. So you're starting to see the algae grow and feed off of this. And this water, this blue area, without any wave action or whitecaps, is actually oxygen depleted. And so it's what's called a dead zone, right? We are sort of at the headwaters of this dead zone down at the Gulf of Mexico, at the Mississippi River Delta, just past New Orleans. So in a way, I'm saying, like, because we all live and consume and use this resource, and it rains on all of us, you know, all of our rooftops, that we're all somewhat complicit in this ecosystem degradation that has global impacts, right? And the solution is actually pretty simple. The solution is that we start to care for water, and we just really start to pay attention to it. If we just start to pay attention to it, we're going to make great strides just through attention. Okay, so that's number one, is kind of starting to pay attention to where water's flowing. This is a interesting slide here, still on the sort of climate level, so big pattern level. We're working our way down to the details. We're right here in St. Louis, right? So the green and blue shades are, and purple shades are wetter areas of the country, right? But there's this really interesting line right here, this really clear delineation where it changes pretty significantly from dry, desertified, arid conditions to more temperate, moist conditions. And this line, interestingly, it passes, so this line corresponds with the 100th meridian, which is a longitudinal line that goes, has sort of been extrapolated on the planet to help us navigate and make maps and things like that. That line, that drought line, corresponds with that meridian. But what's happened is it's moved away from that 100th longitudinal line, and it's actually right over Topeka, Kansas right now, right? So this dry line is actually moving further and further east toward Kansas City, toward St. Louis. And why is that happening? It's largely known to be caused by climate change, is that we're changing the climate, and so we're getting less rainfall, and we're changing our ecosystems, which is changing the climate, and that leads to drought conditions, desertified conditions, and that line is moving closer and closer to St. Louis. So just something to be aware of in terms of climate impacts as things shift and change is that we're actually getting drier. At least all the models say we're going to get drier, and therefore water is going to become a little more precious. We're going to have to start to figure out how to treat it with more care. To that dry note, I was looking at our weather station here up at the farm, and we are just almost exactly 5 inches under our average annual precipitation just from March 1st to today. So I'm not saying that, that is reflective of broader climate shifts. I'm just saying this is our wet season. March, April, May, that's our wettest months of the whole year. And it sets us up, for a dry summer when we don't get a lot of that moisture. So something to sort of pay attention to and realize that, maybe we're actually going to have to figure out how to get water. Like maybe we're actually going to have to figure out better irrigation systems. We're going to have to figure out how to keep our landscapes hydrated, keep our backyard gardens going among dry times. St. Louis can go 2 months with no water. I mean, if you live in the city, you got a tap. You're probably going to be good. The Mississippi River and Missouri River, they're not really going anywhere. But if you don't have a tap and you're relying on existing rainfall, then those drought times are going to ruin you, as happened in 2012 in Missouri during that big drought, and a lot of farmers went under or suffered greatly economically. Moving down to sort of a more at-home level, this is representing residential water use basically across the country. It almost really doesn't change. These statistics are taken from Denver. It changes a little bit by a percentage point or two, but by and large, these hold pretty true. And obviously here, the biggest slice of the pie is outdoor water use. My intention through this presentation is to basically show, like, how do you grow landscapes and food without using water? Right, and just take this whole slice of the pie out. One, that's sort of a water scarcity thing, but also this outdoor water use is greatly what's contributing to the pollution of waterways. The #1 pollutant of rivers in every single city in the United States is one thing, and it's nitrogen runoff, which is from lawn chemicals. So it's lawn fertilizer that's just running off. So we've seen like sprinklers going and they're, overflowing the curb. There's a little like rivulet flowing down the storm gutter. That's that water all goes straight to the river, and it's carrying those nutrients straight with it and causing the conditions we've just talked about. So I like to focus a lot on that. There's also toilets, there's clothes washers, there's showers. Clothes washers and showers, we can at least get a secondary use out of in the form of gray water, which I'll touch on a little bit. We can send our laundry to our landscape, right? We can send our shower to our landscape. Like you spend a day farming and you're covered in soil. This happens to me almost every day, honestly, because I'm just typically covered in soil. There's this like little brown sudsy part of water in the shower, and it's just soil washing off of my body, right, and going into the sewer, which it ultimately goes straight into the river. And if I can send that to the landscape, that's like fertilizer. It's fertigation, you know, it's fertilizer and irrigation all in one. If I can get that out to the landscape and grow peaches or apples or pawpaws or whatever I want to grow, right? So I can get that additional use. Toilets, this is a huge one. I mean, we purified drinking water to piss and shit in it. And a lot of people around the world, like, that's an atrocity, you know, folks that are carting water 10 miles a day from the water source to their home, like that would seem insane, you know, like absolutely insane. And it also is carrying all of our nutrients. Our urine is just nitrogen. It's fertilizer. You know, we buy bottles of fertilizer sometimes, like even organic fertilizers. Our urine, what's coming out of our body, is like a liquid gold. It's fertilizer. You can dilute it 20-1 or 40-1, depending on the concentration you want, and get a liquid fertilizer out of it, right? So basically, it's how do we divert our defecation from the water system? It's through composting toilets. And I'll just say, I know that's sort of like, it could be a taboo subject. Maybe some of y'all are like, hell yeah, I'm super into that. I'll say I'm into that. And I'll also say the city of Tucson, Arizona, one of the driest places in the country, they have no option. So they've been in a 10-year pilot study to look at composting toilets and mandating them in every home, at least in every new construction, because they literally don't have the water to shit in. So they're running out of water and they got to figure out another way to do it. So it's not as maybe archaic as it seems. There are sanitary and good, healthy ways of dealing with our waste that's not flushing it down the drain and into the river. Yeah, I'll save other thoughts. There are other slices of this pie. Leaks is just leaky infrastructure, and faucets, that could also be gray water, though the kitchen faucet's usually not, especially if you're a meat eater, because of contamination issues. So that's why am I showing you this? Just sort of get a picture of water use, like how we relate to it, how does it interact with us as residences. I said earlier, like, we could transform this water crisis that we really have as a global crisis in terms of water quality, but also water scarcity in certain areas. That if we pay attention to it, we're going to actually start to make progress. So here's my invitation to you, is start to pay attention to where water's flowing. Like, walk around your neighborhood, look in your yard. Where's water flowing? Is it designed to shed water as quickly as possible? Typically, yes. You'll find that that's the case. So that most of our especially urban engineering, is designed to get water out away as quickly as possible, okay? And the main entity in charge of that in our area is MSD, or the Metropolitan Sewer District, for St. Louis. And they were sued by the EPA because of that exact design of sort of get water away as quickly as possible, because it's having such negative impacts on water quality in the Mississippi River Basin and the Delta. And so the EPA sued MSD and required them to spend millions and millions of dollars over a certain amount of time through a consent decree on reversing this. Is actually reversing this path to scarcity and creating more of what we're going to see in the rest of this. So my invitation to you is really to just start to pay attention to where water flows. If you're a farmer, if you've got a big piece of land, pay attention to where water's flowing on your land and where it's not also. Like, where's it drying out and where's it too wet? And if you are a homeowner or renter in the city, pay attention to what's going on at your apartment or at your house and see how it's designed. Just start to like tap in, you know. That's really what I'm inviting you to do. You'll also see typical patterns that are displayed really everywhere, especially in cities where we have downspouts that we drain the free drinking or the free water from the sky as rainfall, which is basically drinking water quality, to storm gutters and going into the sewers. And then we pay the city to treat, number one, and plumb and pipe and all the plastic that's involved in that with irrigation systems to then irrigate. I snapped this photo years ago because I was just on a walk and I saw this and I was like, wow, this is like the epitome of not having common sense. You know, when you have free water right here on this little spit of grass, like how anybody would think to put in an irrigation system just to irrigate this. This is winter too, you can see, so there's a little bit of snow on the ground. Just put this on the other corner of the building. You know, it'll at least just spill in here, and it may not grow grass, it might grow better plants than grass. So it'll require a different type of landscaping. So you'll see these kinds of patterns everywhere. You'll also see a lot of this, which I dub organic mattophobia. We're scared of organic matter. We rake the leaves, the lawn clippings, the tree prunings, all of it, cart it away, never to return to the landscape. What is that? Like, what is that doing? Scientifically, what it's doing is we're actually mining carbon from the soil, right? A tree is literally growing up and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and out of the soil to make leaves and branches, and to drop those, to sort of cycle those back down through the soil, so those nutrients and the carbon is all available to the tree at the next growth cycle, right? And if we rake all that up, we're actually desertifying our landscape, because organic matter in the soil, if you've had a soil talk yet, I know you will, at least at some point, you're going to learn, or you may already have, that organic matter is the number one thing to increase in terms of soil improvement. And it's not just about nutrients, it's also about water retention. So the more organic matter you have in your soil, the more water retention you have, the less you have to irrigate, the more your crops grow sort of unfettered, and the quicker you get production. So from a farming standpoint, increasing your organic matter levels is extremely, extremely critical, not just from nutrient storage, but also from water. And when you have consistent water availability to your plants, they produce earlier. That means you get more yield and potentially get to sow another crop and double your planned yield from that space. Okay, so organic matter, organic matter, organic matter. It's our friend. We don't need to rake it up, cart it away. We can actually leave our leaves on our lawn, and it's better. It's better for the lawn. I don't even know why we started raking leaves. It baffles me. This is the path away from scarcity, which is a path to abundance. Okay, it's designing the landscape to retain water, to capture it, to capture runoff, right? So trees are planted on basins, if on a mound inside of a basin. So many of us have seen, I'll go back to this slide, trees planted on mounds. You see this all over the place. Just drive around, you'll see trees planted on mounds. That doesn't make any sense. Trees need water, and a mound drains all the water away. So trees should really be on a mound inside of a basin. If you look in the forest, you almost always see a tree kind of growing up on this raised up platform, which then creates a basin all around it, right? So we're really just patterning off of nature and how trees want to grow naturally. Street runoff is channeled into street side gardens and irrigating street trees, which has really incredible benefits, which I'll touch on later. Our rooftops could go into a cistern, which allows us to have water for later use, right? So if we have 2 months of dry period, we have 1,000 gallons or 2,000 gallons of water right here that we can keep our garden, our vegetable garden going, right? Or we can keep our fruit trees irrigated and happy and not suffering in the drought. And it's all set up. Yes, there's a lot of upfront design and planning and implementation to sort of set this up in the right way, but it's set up so that it can function passively. so that when a rain falls, like we don't have to go and open taps, we don't have to open valves. It's just all naturally set up so that it flows and functions like an ecosystem. And then we get more time to kick it on our porch and play an instrument, right? Or have an extra beer or whatever it is that you like to do. You get a little more time. So a lot of permaculture is really focused on upfront design and planning. And there's a great little quote from a guy named Jeff Lawton, who's a permaculture teacher, and he says that in a typical design system, you're spending 1 hour of thinking and 100 hours of labor. In a permaculture system, you're more likely to spend 100 hours thinking and 1 hour of labor. So it's kind of like reversing. It's sort of, it invites us to stop and question and inquire about what's going on and how we can do things in a better, smarter way. So we work smarter, not harder. Not to say that we get rid of hard work. I love hard work too. So it's not to say that it's even desirable to get rid of that, but we don't need to create more of it necessarily. There's enough work to do. This is one of the driest places. And if you're feeling, by the way, let me just sort of check in here. If you're feeling a little blue, like, damn, this is dark, you know, our water system isn't going so well. Where's the silver lining here? We're like walking through Mordor, and we will end in the Shire. So stick with me. There's lots of green things ahead. This one image here, all the green things come right after this image, actually. This is one of the driest places in North America. It's the Avra Valley in Arizona. I'm standing on top of a berm. I took a class out here 8 years ago or so on a field trip, and I'm standing on a berm and I'm looking west, and I turn around and I snap this photo directly on the other side of the berm, right? Like, what's going on there? This is so desertified. This is like what we think of as desert, right? How on earth could it get like this sort of forested ecosystem? It's all through infiltration. Okay, so that berm that I'm standing on is perpendicular to the slope, so that water flowing from these ridges and across these slopes hits this berm and stops, and it has nothing to do but infiltrate into the ground. They didn't plant these trees. All they did was build berms. There's about 20 of them. These were built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it was really a project to green the desert, or re-green the desert, actually, because the desert was once a lot greener. The reason the desert is the way it is actually through overgrazing. So cattle, sheep, and goats were released on the landscape uncontrolled, and they basically chewed the thing to pieces. And that's what we see as the desert now. But it wasn't always so. And we see a lot of that same pattern play out across our landscapes, particularly agricultural landscapes, where we have forests on steeper slopes that are cleared to grow annual crops like corn. And we get massive erosion and ecosystem degradation. It's basically like this mini desert that we create by removing the trees. So how we get the trees back is by increasing infiltration. Those slides, the path to scarcity and the path to abundance, they come from a guy named Brad Lancaster. This is one of his books. I don't know if you can see this. I can't see myself, so. The book is called Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond. It's not just limited to here. He introduced me to this site, and he also says, if you plant the water, the plants plant themselves. So the goal is to actually just increase infiltration, and the ecosystem comes back. I'm on a project right now, just northwest of Earth Dance, and we have 240 acres, 125 of which are former corn and soy fields that are basically deserts with massive erosion gullies, like canyons in them that are 12, 15 feet deep because of lack of vegetation. And our goal is to increase the infiltration so that the vegetation comes back and the landscape can actually support it. So this is not confined, the sort of beyond in that book title I just said is critical. How rain and trees interact is actually integral to understanding the water cycle and water flow. Trees, one, they intercept rainfall so that it then sort of drips down more gently to the soil, and that attenuates the flow or slows down the flow so that it isn't causing erosion and isn't just running off, the water isn't running off the landscape, it's actually able to absorb. Trees also store a ton of water in their biomass, in their selves, and they generate organic matter, which we just talked about, to hold on to water, particularly high in the soil profile where a lot of our plant roots live. Certain trees have roots that can go a lot deeper, but certainly our annual plants are fairly shallow rooted. There's exceptions, like carrots have roots that can go down to 9 feet deep. But typically, you know, like lettuce, kale, tomatoes, you know, those are root systems that don't go any deeper than 2.5, 3 feet at the most. So it's super critical to keep organic matter high up in the soil profile where we can store water and have it be available to the plants we grow. How wind and trees interact is also really interesting, particularly from a slowing down evaporation standpoint. A lot of market farmers are realizing that having tree rows, and earth dances among them, having tree rows among annual crops is a really beneficial thing because you're slowing down wind speeds and you're not getting the massive evaporation rates that you would normally have. You can also have those trees be productive and you get additional yields out of them. So the berms at Earth Dance are doing just this. They're slowing down wind speeds, they're building up organic matter, they're also productive plants in the form of fruit trees, and that has a direct impact on the water cycle, how much you have to irrigate, basically. I say that we're moving from landscaping to land shaping. So we have to actually shape the land properly to keep our soil, to keep our water on it, if we're to hold on to that stuff. Otherwise, we're likely to lose a lot of that stuff and continue to contribute to the dead zone, like we talked about. So to shape the land, it's largely to build depressions, things that can hold water and accumulate soil. In wet areas, you need to be careful with that so that you don't do that on a clay soil and you just basically build a pond. So there's a lot to this, and understanding what strategy to use in what context. So that's particularly why I'm recommending this book. If this work kind of fancies you, if you're interested in this, this book details a lot of all those details that are extremely necessary to do this work in an effective way. All of us have a mountain, basically, or the top of a watershed in our yards, and it's our rooftops, right? It's this impervious surface that is above us, and it sheds thousands and thousands of gallons of water every single year through our gutters and in our downspouts. Okay, and we don't typically value that as a resource. This presentation will basically demonstrate why we should value that as a resource and what's possible once we do. So I'm also showing this slide because this was the first, when I moved from Arizona to Colorado, this was the first rain garden that I built on this landscape. We cut this tree, that tree was dead. We cut that down and had one downspout here. And I calculated the roof surface area and I figured out this downspout, just this one, even in Colorado, which gets, this place gets 18 inches of rain a year. St. Louis, for example, gets about 40 inches of rain a year, so more than double of what this place in Colorado gets. This one downspout sheds over 9,000 gallons of water a year. Let's picture 9,000 gallons of water. What does that look like? It's a gasoline tanker truck. So if you see like a tanker truck at the gas station filling up the reservoirs or on the highway, that's 9,000 gallons of water. This downspout shedding over that amount every single year. So just imagine that much infiltrating into the soil. It's profoundly impactful to put that much water back in contact with the soil. And there is no standing water here. You know, it's free draining into a basin, which overflows into another basin, which overflows into a third basin, which overflows into a fourth basin, right? And I went to this garden actually in what was dubbed a 1,000-year rain event. In 2013, this city got such a big rainstorm. I mean, it was a catastrophic flood, and historically or statistically, it was a rain event that would occur once every 1,000 years, which is impressive. And naturally, I was very curious, what happened to all these gardens? Like, how did they perform? And this one in particular, it wasn't even overflowing in that rain event. It was all being absorbed, which is really just a testament to how much capacity the soil has to absorb and hold on to water, right? It's made to do that, right? The only reason it doesn't do that, particularly in urban areas, is because we've paved over it, right? If all the pavement wasn't there, we wouldn't have all the runoff that we have. Or if we don't clear forests or plow hundreds and hundreds of acres under to grow things like corn and soy, then we don't have those impervious surface issues, right? So we're really just kind of restoring the natural condition of the ground. This is after installation. We irrigated this for 3 months because it's a dry climate, really dry climate, like you have to irrigate. After that, we took it off. This is 2 years later, this is 4 years later, okay? So the point here is really that just look at what's possible with putting water back in contact with the soil. And it's not like these are desert plants, you know, this is elderberry, this is an edible plum, there's currants, there's gooseberries, there's service berries or June berries, medicinal plants like comfrey and monarda and sage. It's not a desertified, it's not to say like we should have desert environments, because we don't need to. We have a mountain range in our yard and it's draining thousands and thousands of gallons of water every year. That is a resource. And if it's not a resource, or if it's not valued as a resource, it ends up as a pollutant. So these are basins. I'm also I'm sort of stacking functions here, and these are basins which is a specific technique for water harvesting. And I'll show you a couple other examples. These are also infiltration basins. Basically just like round-ish depressions that hold water. This was designed by Brad Lancaster, and he went to this community. It was already built, and he was hired as the landscape architect to do the landscape. And he said, okay, I'm familiar with this pattern. This is a canyon. Here's the ridge on this side. Here's the ridge on this side. What happens in nature? The ridges drain into the canyon. So we just take these impervious ridges and we drain it into the canyon. Okay, this is before planting and mulch. This is after planting and mulch, just 1 year. Never irrigated with city water, mind you, in a climate that gets 12 inches of rain a year. 12 inches of rain a year, really, really dry. This is 10 years later. Okay, this is the desert. They're growing a food forest in the middle of this co-housing community, just off of the water that's falling on these roofs and some of these walkways. Okay, so they're growing things like pomegranates, figs, citrus, a lot of native edible plants like mesquite and palo verde. The Sonoran Desert in particular, Tucson area, is filled with native edible plants. A lot of cacti are particularly edible. So they've used the whole plant palette, and so they're producing food for no work, right? Because they thought it through, they designed it, and they built it right, and the food just grows, right? The water's getting planted and the plants grow themselves. So those are basins. Again, roundish structures that are depressions that serve to hold water. Swales are another technique of harvesting water, which is really just an elongated basin, right? It's just a depression that's linear. It's really long and holds water or moves water. So you have two types of swales. One of them is contour swale, which has a level bottom. So it's even throughout the entire course of the swale. And that means when water flows into it, it would fill up the whole thing evenly. You also have diversion swales, which are moving water from point A to point B, right? From one place to another. And different ones of those diversion swales or contour swales are called for in different circumstances. In the case of growing fruit trees on a swale, you would want even water distribution, usually if it's just across a slope and capturing what flows across the land. So you do want that level bottom so that water that flows into it fills up the whole thing evenly and all the trees get the same amount of water. This case, this is at the Utah State University in Moab. I designed and built this project, and we basically just looked around. One, they had a nutrition program, and they were like, we want our landscape to reflect some of our academic work, and we want our students to learn how to produce food and process that food. And so we built this edible landscape that harvested water off of the parking lot, the roof surfaces. It's like 125,000 gallons of water every single year that goes through this swale in a climate that gets 9 inches of rain a year. If you've ever been to southern Utah, it's like Martian landscape, super duper dry. So the only way that I would have even done that is with harvested rainwater. Like you couldn't justify pulling water out of the Colorado River to irrigate fruit trees. I can't anyway. So this is a diversion swale moving water from these points where it flows in and beyond this way. Here's it flowing. There's a downspout that goes through this piece of sidewalk and flows through. And then when it rains, it's like this sort of beautiful interactive landscape that's acting like a river. It's an ecosystem. It sort of harkens to nature. And it makes people feel connected to the natural world. I think this kind of stuff has an incredible psychological impact. And in fact, research is really demonstrating that increasingly with studies on mental health and immune system health, particularly at this moment in time, and working with the soil and having sort of direct contact with ecosystems. But also crime. In neighborhoods that have more street trees, they have lower incidences of crime. And this has been sort of replicated across cities in the country to where the only conclusion can be that having trees around reduces crime. Maybe it calms people down. Maybe it, trees are like mediators. I don't know exactly how that's functioning, but I think it's beautiful, and I think we should plant more trees and have more of this kind of stuff. This is a year after planting and mulching everything. This is year 2, I mean, and this is year 3. So in 3 years, like there's this oasis in the desert suddenly full of peaches and cherries and plums and grapes climbing this arbor and figs and currants and native edible ethnobotanical plants like Indian rice grass. It's an ecosystem, and people can't even help but be in it in a downpour like this guy here. So I think that's sort of a testament to the work, is that somebody's going to run out there in the rain and check it out and see what's going on, to interact with it and pay attention to it. Just another view of that in the fall, prettiness. Swales. So those are diversion swales, contour swales. You can also have wood chips as a swale. You could just lay wood chips on the contour of the landscape perpendicular to the slope. And yes, water will back up behind it and infiltrate, and more plants are going to grow. That's great. And you don't have to dig in the soil to do it. That's even better. So you get this generated abundance from waste material, because you can, most of you probably know, if you don't, you can get free wood chips from most tree companies, right? So you just lay that stuff out on the contour of the landscape and just start to retain a little bit of water. It doesn't even have to work perfectly. Just retain a little bit and slow the water down and increase infiltration. You'll probably be surprised by how green it stays all year or all season long. Whereas it may dry up, you know, in the hottest months like the end of July and August here, particularly if it's dry. So those are swales. Terraces, also another water harvesting strategy. This is a terraced vineyard in a climate that gets 10 inches of rain a year. Basically what this does is take a pitched landscape that water runs off of and flattens it, right? So you end up with these terraces that can at least soak the water in that falls on it and infiltrate that. In this case, it's not enough to keep a whole vineyard very happy, so they have these irrigation lines, but it does reduce the amount of irrigation, which is great. At this point, I like to sort of point out that this stuff isn't new, you know, and I didn't invent this stuff, you know, nor did Brad Lancaster, who wrote the books that are, you know, being used all over the world and translated into lots and lots of languages. He didn't invent this stuff, right? So people have been doing this all over the world for thousands and thousands of years without technology, without calculations, just by being the instrument themselves, right? And so we become the instrument that can interpret the landscape and understand it so that we know how to interact with it, so that we can last, so that we can build a sustainable society, civilization. And I like to point that out, one, just because we're drawing from really ancient wisdom here, and it's kind of calling us back, I think, to sort of a more original nature, I guess, I would say, and that's how I feel anyway. And so that we can really like embody our intelligence as human beings and know how to interact with the landscape and become a part of it and sort of merge with it, so that we're not ruining our landscapes, so that we're actually improving our landscapes. And we also know that ruining landscapes ruins human communities. And so the more we improve our landscapes, the more we can improve our communities. We know that just from the science we just talked about, with studies coming out showing the benefits of street trees, right? So I just like to point that out, that this isn't new stuff. Any of us that take this work up aren't necessarily like some hero because we're doing this work. We're really just like embodying our original nature, which is to become a little more one with the things around us, I think, and particularly the landscape. So there's that piece. Tiffany, let me just check in with you. Are there any like burning questions that have come up? Because I can't see a chat, and so I just want to make sure there's not like a crucial piece of understanding.
I'm glad you paused. I was just about to ask you in about 5 minutes to pause to allow for questions if anyone had any.
Let's pause here.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and fire away.
All at once now. Are there questions in the chat? Or maybe there's not a chat set up. I don't actually know.
No, there is a chat set up. Most of the chat is just, you know, awe.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
Most of us are in awe of some of the information, and just agreeing that a lot of this is really awesome, and wanting to implement what it is that you're talking about in our projects, because
Awesome.
it is, like you said, natural systems. You know, this is nothing new. It's just embodying the things that we are gifted.
Yeah, exactly.
And support nature in that way.
Totally.
No questions? Come on, y'all.
I have a question.
Thanks,
All right. Okay, so Jason, here's my question. I live in Wildwood, and my house like a mountain over a hill. The backyard's very steep.
Yep.
And then the backyard are septic lines because we don't have the sewer system here.
Right.
So is there a way that I could create some sort of swales or something like that, or basins?
To slow the water down?
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. The whole point is to slow water down, spread it out, and sink it into the ground. So if you sort of keep that motto in your mind of slow it, spread it, sink it, you're going to find ways to do it, number one. And you may invent ways of doing it, or sort of come up with a way that is unique to your site, and it's not just replicating a technique. But that said, different techniques are appropriate on different slopes. And so you really want to, I would say, before doing anything on a sloped ground, particularly because of how erosive our soils can be, pick up this book. And it'll detail what's appropriate on different slope percentages. And you can calculate, it'll teach you how to calculate your own slope percentage, which is pretty fun to do. And
yeah, no, I mean, I think it's great. I can see like where the rainwater goes down the hill and then it, you know, washes away all of the soil, and yeah,
yep,
so that's
exactly. So reduce that as much as possible. And I'll also say Wildwood particularly, I've hiked a lot around there, and knowing a bit of the natural history, it was all deforested. And that's why there's like gravel down in all the bottoms of the streams. It's actually because all the soil washed off, and then once the soil washed off, the gravel all washed off and ended up at the bottom in the streams. So to bring the soil back onto the slope, or at least retain what's already there and allow it to accumulate even more, is really quite a repairing act. And I encourage you to do it as much as you can.
great. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. If you have a question, I'm just going to say, feel free to unmute yourself. I do really like a conversational style. But I'm just going to go ahead and, yeah, raise your hand, or I don't know if I can see the hand raising thing actually. So maybe just unmute yourself and don't feel shy to interrupt me. So street water runoff. This is a particular concern, typically among folks who are just sort of starting to think about this work. We tend to think that our streets have a lot of pollution, and we would think that a lot of that may be petrochemicals, gasoline, oil spills, you know, whatever, like your radiator blows up and drips a bunch of petrochemical fluid on the surface, and that gets washed off in the rain. Yes, that's true. You know, that stuff does happen. But again, nitrogen is the predominant runoff, or the predominant pollutant that is running off of city streets. And as I said, nitrogen is plant food. It's just plant food. It's the precursor to protein, actually. So if you think about beans or peas, they're nitrogen fixing plants, meaning they're plants that have they have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere, because there's a lot of gaseous nitrogen in the atmosphere, and fix that into the plants to make it available to the plant. And then when that plant dies, to the soil. Think about peas and beans. Where are they really high in nutritional content? Protein, right? So nitrogen is the precursor to protein. Basically, protein is like the essential building block for life, and without it you don't have much. So valuing nitrogen is kind of just like valuing life, and plants will use it. So if you, in this case, here's this little arrow here pointing to this gutter here that's able to drain street runoff into this little rain garden and grow these trees. Those trees are like, great, this is fertilizer coming in every time it rains, you know? And the river's like, great, because you don't have excess runoff going into the river and carrying all those pollutants into it, and it can't deal with it. And to touch on the petrochemical pollution, petrochemicals are natural for one thing, and soil organisms can actually break them down. They're just hydrocarbons, And so fungi in particular can break it down into the benign elements of hydrogen and carbon. And it sort of breaks the bond that makes those things toxic. So having street water runoff go into these street side basins with healthy soil is actually a great thing in terms of breaking down those pollutants as well. So it isn't just about nitrogen. It is about those as well, but also those are just food for another organism in the cycle of life, in this case, fungi. And fungi, by the way, is sort of a build it, if you build it, they will come. So if you build your soil up with lots of organic matter, particularly woody mulch, you're just going to get a ton of fungi growing. You can't stop it. So you don't really have to do anything special. There's also a lot to say about what happens with tree health, growing edible plants in street side rain gardens, and soil health as well. So the city of Tucson, again, has really been a leader in this work. They did a 10-year study of street side rain gardens that were planted with food plants. Mostly what they wanted to determine was, is toxicity from the street, from anything, any kind of pollutant in the street, ending up in something that somebody could eat, right? So an apple off the tree, or a pawpaw, or a piece of fruit of any kind. They found over 10 years of monitoring, there wasn't a single case of anything toxic in the fruit of woody perennials growing in these street side rain gardens. And so what they've determined through that is basically, if you want to grow food that's interacting with street runoff, you have to grow woody perennials. So things like trees or shrubs, things that have a woody stem and can filter, basically it acts as a carbon filter to filter out all those pollutants. Incidentally, they did a bunch of research on soil health, and they found the biological activity of the soil in these street side rain gardens was better than the typical, what are called hell strips or parking stands, the area between the sidewalk and the street, that rain gardens capturing the polluted street runoff had better soil health, better soil organism health than ones that weren't capturing street water runoff, which is curious. It's not curious once you really know that nitrogen and petrochemicals act as a feedstock for soil organisms. So once you get that, it's like, this is the filter. This is what we do with street water, period. This is what the EPA sued MSD to do, is more of this. And it just makes too much sense to not do it if this can be our pollution filter, right? What they also found was, in comparison to controls that were street side gardens that weren't capturing street runoff from ones that were, they found the ones that were capturing street runoff, the trees grew 33% faster than over the period of 10 years. Okay, so that's significant. One, because you get an even greater impact of that sort of tree canopy on the urban ecosystem, but also the trees are capturing 33% more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, right? It's like, how is that not just the best thing that we could be doing? That's my point there, is really to say, like, we harvest street runoff. We're not just harvesting street runoff so we can have a free source of irrigation for our plants or our food plants. We're harvesting street runoff so it can be our pollution filter, so it can protect our rivers and all the life that's in them, and so that we can actually have increased effects on carbon sequestration and the slowing of climate change, or the drawdown of carbon in our atmosphere in general. So many co-benefits and multiple benefits here. Permaculture is all about doing one action and getting many different yields out of it. This is it, like, you do this and you get all those different yields, and I'll talk more yields as we go through this. Here's one of them: the urban heat island effect. This is a thermal image of a city. The blue is water, so it's very cool. The green is tree canopy. And the yellow, orange, and red is buildings or pavement, so impervious surface. And it basically just goes to show like how we're actually heating our urban environments through overpaving, or through the reduction of tree canopy. And when you get that tree canopy to grow up over the pavement, it's shading the pavement from the sun, and the sun isn't, and the pavement's not absorbing all that energy as heat, right? So we know for a fact that most cities are 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside that's just outside of them, right? All around the world, actually. And that leads to a number of things. One, it leads to irritability in people because it's hotter. Two, it leads to, I'm having a empty brain moment. It leads to higher energy consumption. We're having to cool down 10 more degrees, right, in our air conditioning usage than we would otherwise if we had a more treed landscape. So you start to see like cities in China or urban planning that's really at the cutting edge. It's actually all about dealing with life. It's all about vegetation and incorporating trees and covering buildings with vines and putting gardens on rooftops. Right? It's actually about partnering with life. It's sort of merging the hard landscape with the soft landscape of life. And the benefits are obvious. If we reduce energy consumption in the summer months in particular, what are we also doing? We're reducing energy usage, right? So we're reducing climate change by doing that, right? So this little thing that you can do in your yard even, and I'm not saying that this is only effective in a hyper urban environment. This same effect can occur in your yard, does occur in your yard. The more vegetation you have around the house, the cooler it is, and the lower your energy bills are going to be, right? And the lower your carbon footprint's going to be. So if you want really good, healthy trees and quick growing trees, you ought to harvest the water off your roof and get all those co-benefits too. This is Brad Lancaster's house before he learned permaculture. This is his garage. This is the sidewalk. It's just this sort of compacted, rubbly gravel dirt that people would even park up on. And after he learned permaculture, it looked like this, 10 years after, right? 15 years later, it looks like that. And he even put the before photo up as a street sign so people walking by could get a little education. I love that. It's just sort of passive eco propaganda. I'm all about that stuff. How did he do this? He cut the curb. He cut the curb so that the water that's flowing through the storm gutter could actually get into this soil space. And then he planted trees. Right? It was illegal at the time when he cut this curb to do this. Yeah, do we have a question? I see somebody popping in. No? Okay, mute. He cut the curb at the time it was illegal, and the city actually he's on a corner lot, and he cut the curb in multiple places, so it was pretty obvious and visible. Public Works came by and knocked on his door and said, hey, you know, deface city property, basically, you're going to have to pay a fine for that. And he was like, oh, okay. And just tried to ignore it. They didn't relent and came back and said, you know, you're not addressing this. We're kind of waiting for you to pay the fine so that we can repair this and resolve this situation. He said, look, this just makes too much sense to me. I can't undo this because of all the benefits that it has, right? I'm growing street trees in this desert urban environment that's super duper hot. We're bringing wildlife back to the neighborhood, like birds that hadn't been seen in the neighborhood in a decade started to come back. We're producing food. A lot of these are food-bearing plants. We're bringing the community together to educate ourselves about this. And more of my neighbors are starting to replicate this. And I'm taking the burden off of the storm sewers, right? So this is actually why the EPA lawsuit against MSD in St. Louis sort of worked out in their favor, because they also realized that taking water off of the streets and out of the storm sewers really has a lot of impacts in terms of combined sewer flow. Because St. Louis, our stormwater sewers and our sewers, like when we flush the toilet, those sewers, they're actually connected further down the line. And when the storm sewers that are just capturing street runoff by and large are surging and going into the sewer, it can actually cause sewer backups. And so people get sewer backups in your homes. Some of you may have even experienced that. This does happen in St. Louis somewhat frequently. So they're putting in these rain gardens to basically relieve that burden on the storm sewers and reduce that effect as much as possible. So Brad said this to the city of Tucson. He said, look, this just makes too much sense. You can't ask me to not do this. And they were like, and he said, let me get in front of your bosses, or let me talk to your planning department. So eventually he got in, he was able to have a conversation and educate them on this work. And they were like, you know what, you're right, we'll let you keep it. And he said, well, I don't want to just keep it, I kind of want to encourage it. And so they worked together, and the city bought a curb sawing machine to where they'll come and cut the curb for you. All you have to do is mark it with spray paint where you want it cut, and you make your call, and they'll schedule your appointment. So I put this here, like, civil disobedience pays off. He broke the law because the law didn't make any sense, right? But he did it in a way that was relatively educational, and it's had profound impacts across the entire city of Tucson and the entire state of Arizona and all the neighboring dry states, because he's going around speaking and talking up this work. So the city's putting in things like speed bumps that double as water steering devices. So the runoff's flowing this way and hits the speed bump and gets channeled to this shady little treed parking island, right? A lot of us have had that frustrating experience getting into like a steaming hot, 200-degree car in the middle of the summer if we've been parked in a parking lot, right? Let's just grow some more trees up over that parking lot so more of us can park in the shade, right? We have the runoff from the parking surface itself to grow the trees. It's not going to cost anything. It might take up a few parking spaces to do it, or we could just design it from the get-go and incorporate it from the jump without having to, retrofit it in. We did the same thing at Utah State University in Moab. We poured these tree islands in concrete and poured these curb cuts, and they just collect water. You can see it's pooling up in these basins, and it's feeding these trees and shrubs that are eventually going to grow up and shade this parking lot, which isn't really about keeping cars cool. That's more of like an incidental benefit. It's really about reducing this little microclimate of urban heat island effect of this asphalt that's just absorbing the sunlight and retaining the heat and radiating that out all night and keeping it a lot hotter than it otherwise would be. Water, I love it. Green roofs. These are really appropriate, particularly in a place like St. Louis where we get a lot of rainfall. They're not really appropriate in dry places. So I'm all about green roofs in St. Louis. I think it's great. They are pretty expensive, so it's not to say that it's the go-to solution or the first thing one should consider. And it's just as well, mind you, to let the water run off the roof and collect it down at the ground and channel it where you want it to go. You do get all these co-benefits with green roofs, though, of reducing noise in buildings and also reducing energy consumption, both heat and cooling, because it acts as a sort of like thermal insulative blanket on top of the building, which buildings typically lose their heat out of the roof because heat rises, and they gain their heat in the summer from the sun just sort of beating down on the asphalt shingles or whatever the roof surface is. So that's been a lot of urban stuff, and sort of like backyard or front yard focused, and definitely front yard focused. I want to make that point. Don't confine this to your backyard. Don't hide it. Show it off. Be proud of it. I want to move a little bit to some more rural applications in terms of farm scale stuff. Keyline design is a really leading farm planning tool for water in particular, and I'll explain what some of this means. So you have to know your contour lines to kind of figure this out. The key line is the contour line that is at the point where the slope turns from really steep to a little flatter. And if you know how to read contour maps, basically the closer the lines are together, the more steep the ground is, and the further apart they are, the flatter it is, or the more gentle the slope is. So right at this point is that key line, right? Where you can see these close together lines, super duper steep, and then it starts to gradiate and flatten out a little bit. This is where springs tend to form. And I'm gonna back up to the first image here and just show you like this little arc here of cottonwood trees, because this whole thing is full of springs and it's supporting this little mini forest, just from the natural topography. Where we harmonize with that is realizing that, oh, we could actually use that to our benefit or as a resource. This is maybe the place where we want to store water in the landscape, right? This is one, it's flatter, so it's safer to build a pond, for example, to irrigate a piece of ground. And two, it's where water already pops out of the ground anyway. And so we may have this sort of like artesian spring-fed pond that's this sort of endless irrigation device, basically. And I'm going to show you a couple other applications here. So just to sort of visualize this without contour lines, super duper steep slope, key point in this drainage, right? And then the key line, so you could build a pond there where it flattens out, and the key line radiates out from there. And you could connect the two ponds, one overflows into the other. You can dig ditches or swales from those ponds where you can open a gate and sort of flood lines of trees. You could also supply water to an entire community if you have the topography to do so. And you can use that topography, use the gravity from it to pressurize your system, so you don't actually have to have a pump and you're not using energy to move your water that way. On the more like prepper side, like if the power goes out and your whole irrigation system is dependent on a pump, guess what? You have no irrigation water. Or if your water system itself is dependent on a pump. That's a little bit about keyline. It's really about where to locate ponds for your irrigation and what we can do with that, and basically move water from these drainages where it's already concentrated, to the drier ridges, right? So you actually can take this water that's concentrated here and send it to these drier ridges so that you end up with a more evenly irrigated landscape, and that can support food production, certainly. I have one more slide to talk about this, but before I do, I want to recommend this book, the only other book I'm recommending. So not to say that there's not a lot of other books to recommend, just don't want to hit you too heavy. This is called Water for Any Farm. It's by a guy named Mark Shepard. Mark Shepard actually did some of the design work at Earth Dance originally, especially with the tree rows and the swales, to slow down water on those slopes. This book will really, really detail this method. If you're all about broad scale farm-based food production, and that's why you're in this program, this book is it. You know, this is going to help you plan your water system for irrigation. Potentially you're raising animals, so keeping stock watered and all of that. This device is
what's the title of the book one more time, please? Thank you.
Yep, Water for Any Farm. He's sort of He's updating a book that was titled Water for Every Farm, which is just often described as the driest book on water ever written. People have a really hard time getting through it. And so Mark kind of took this on and was like, I'm going to write a more accessible version of this book so people can actually start doing more of this. Because that original book was just really hard to get through. That original book was by a guy named P.A. Yeomans, an Australian fellow. That's why this is called a yeoman's plow. He also invented this device, which is it's not really a plow as much as a ripper. And these lines are from this tractor passing over this area previously. And so these are basically like shanks that go down into the soil and kind of have a shoe-like thing on them. And it basically just rips these little trenches along the perpendicular to the slope, so along the contour, so that water that falls on this piece of ground can actually penetrate the ground again, right? Because this ground, I don't know, this piece of ground could have been overgrazed, which got really compacted. It could have been cropped for too long and got really compacted that way. And the more compact your soil is, the more runoff you're going to get, and the less infiltration you're going to get, and the less life, therefore, you can support. So this ripper is really about creating furrows in the soil so water can repenetrate that hard pan layer. If you're rehabbing a farm that's been grown in annual crops and big tractors have been driven on it for years and years and years or decades, this is a great tool to sort of undo some of that damage. You don't really need it every year. It's really more of like a every 2, 3, 5 year kind of application. And this guy is particularly thinking because he's got seed boxes on his, and he has a compost tea set up here as a fertigation. And so he's seeding, he's ripping and reseeding the pasture and fertilizing the pasture in one pass. So the wheelbase of that tractor only has to go over this ground one time, and you get that much less compaction versus going over it 3 times to do all those functions, right? So that's thinking smarter and not working as hard. I'm gonna leave this out because I want to get to some other things. This is really more about like watershed restoration. I will say there are check dams at Earth Dance. I designed and built them. The whole parking area, which we dubbed the parking grove, is really designed as a way to capture water that's running off of the farm as excess and kind of like re-establish the stream channel through that area, and also get a bunch of parking and grow a bunch of trees to shade that parking surface. So I know we're all not supposed to leave our homes and all that stuff, but I do hope that you all will sort of get to end your apprenticeship in person and get to interact with some of the great stuff that Earth Dance has going on. And you'll see these things in action if you're there during a heavy rainstorm. I want to talk about cisterns because this is particularly appropriate for gardeners, and I'm seeing more and more very serious gardeners in St. Louis put in cisterns, particularly because they're seeing these dry periods occur, and folks want to use their water falling off their roof as a resource. You may go to, I guess, no, never mind. Before the pandemic, you would go to Matt Liebon's yard and you'd see his cistern. So he's doing the same thing. A cistern, what does this allow you to do? It allows you to have water backup. It allows you to have a backup system so that when you have a month of dry time, you have a store of water that you can use as irrigation. Okay, when you do the rain garden thing, you don't really have a store of water, even though the soil can hold a ton of water, and deep down there, the plant roots that can reach it, at least, they're going to be fine. It's really more like annual vegetables and shallow rooted plants need consistent water. So a cistern helps you do that. This is just a culvert that's sunken into a wet concrete platform, and then it seals up and solidifies and dries, and boom, you have a cistern, and you can get these prefab lids for it. So sort of a homemade cistern setup. This is a cistern you can buy. This is Ryan Young here. He's a former Earth Dance apprentice, so he's been through this program. And look at what he's done to his yard. He's transformed his whole yard into this edible water harvesting ecosystem. And he's got pawpaws and apples and peaches and figs and all kinds of different food-bearing plants. He put all of his downspouts on his house to use and ran all of them through cisterns first, and then the cisterns overflowed into his rain gardens, okay, which is a really smart way to do it, because every raindrop gets captured in the cistern, and let's say the rain just stops for a month, he's got full cisterns, right? And he's got all this water retention in the soil, and he can irrigate any place in his yard with gravity from these cisterns because of the way he set it up. He does the he's on, I should say, the Sustainable Backyard Garden Tour. He actually won the award of Garden of the Year award last year. And you can tour this site if you do the Sustainable Backyard Garden Tour, assuming that it can happen, hoping that it can happen. These cisterns, I call these slimline cisterns. One, that's the brand, the brand is Bushman, and Slimline is the type. They're really narrow, and so they're really convenient in an urban setting. Like he lives in Tower Grove South, where the houses are really close together. You can't really get away with these big round tanks. They take up too much ground. These Slimlines are great because they just sort of press right up against the house and they blend in a little bit more. So I love those. This is a big Bushman cistern. Matt Liebon has something that is very similar to this. It is a Bushman, it's just a slightly different size. These are plug and play. They're basically ready to go. You have an overflow, you have an inflow, you just do the plumbing and you plug them in and press go, which means dance for rain. This is a 2,000-gallon cistern that was a discarded container that was used to store olive oil. And he got it off Craigslist for free. It's clear, or it allows light in. It's not exactly clear. It's translucent. And you don't want to have light get into your cistern. If you look at all these, they're dark. They're not allowing water to get in to the cistern. Hang on one second. I'm going to really quickly plug my computer in because I just got the low battery warning.
You guys enjoying this enrichment class so far?
Yes, this is incredible.
Loving it.
Awesome. Well, while he's getting his charger, I just want to remind you guys to make sure you do your feedback form right after class. Class isn't over until you fill out your feedback form. All right, Jason, I think we're ready.
Okay, great. Cisterns. These are all non-light. They don't let light in. Adrian, my friend who built this one, decided to put a fence around his cistern and then pack rocks in between the cistern and put a roof on it to exclude light. And the roof allowed him to actually harvest water off of his cistern, right? His cistern isn't just harvesting water, it's generating water to harvest. And he's growing, you can just barely see in this photo, grapes up the cistern. At this point, the grapes just sort of swallow this whole thing, and they also help to keep light out of the water. If you get light in your cistern water, you're gonna grow algae. And the algae is gonna clog your fittings, your valves. It's sort of gonna be a bit of a nightmare, and the water quality is not as high for irrigation. So that's sort of a principle about cisterns. This is a ferro cement cistern, basically built out of chicken wire and a type of cement called shotcrete. And you just basically plaster over this chicken wire in really any shape that you want. This is the cheapest way to store the most amount of water. This cistern stores 12,000 gallons of water, and it serves as a major irrigation source for this tropical farm in Hawaii. In Austin, Texas. So I'm also trying to show you things like from all around the country. Like this is a thing, this is happening all over the place, not just in dry places. In Austin, Texas, they actually get a ton of rain. It's just that they get all this rain in one time of the year, and then they have like 4 or 5 months of bone dry conditions. I will also say I'm showing this because if you look at climate projections, basically St. Louis becomes like Dallas, Fort Worth in terms of climate, which means they have really wet periods and then they have really long dry periods, kind of like Austin does. This is a botanic garden, and it's all water harvesting. If you ever go to Austin, this is a great place to check out. This is an observation tower. It's a 3-story cistern that has a spiral staircase that doubles as an observation tower. They're doing super innovative stuff that's really attractive and beautiful. This is an aqueduct channeling water from a building out to this cistern to irrigate, here's the blow up, to irrigate this other area of the garden that doesn't have any buildings around it. So how are they going to get water to it? It's patterned off of what people have been doing for thousands of years, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. The Romans are most well known for their aqueducts, but they got it from North Africa and the Middle East, very dry places that had to figure out how to manage water in better ways.
I have a
Great.
quick question.
Yeah.
So, hi, I have like vacant land, and I was trying to figure out where I'm going to get this water source from. So, when you're talking about cisterns, it's like a light bulb, but I don't know much about it. But is it realistic to try to figure out how to do a cistern for vacant land, because I have no other water source?
If you don't have any buildings, you have no water to fill up the cistern with. So no.
Okay.
If you do have buildings next door, for example, you could, potentially.
Okay, there is a building next door, but that's what I was saying. There are no cisterns that you have to have a runoff from a building.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Otherwise, I would just say, your strategy shifts. It's not about cisterns. It's about really building up your soil so that it retains water as much as possible. And you choose to grow in a mulched type setting to really reduce water demand.
Okay, so like sheet mulching?
Yep, sheet mulching would be great, straw mulch, and just even continually growing cover crops on top of that to always just every year build more and more organic matter and water holding capacity.
Okay, thank you.
Gray water, I touched on earlier. It's basically secondary. It's a secondary use of water from a laundry machine, from a shower, bath, or a bathroom sink. Kitchen sinks are typically not considered gray water. Brad Lancaster, I show this mostly to show off something else, which is that
Why are kitchen sinks not considered gray water?
it's not gray water. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Kitchen sink water should not be used as gray water.
Why not?
Unless if you're a vegetarian, yeah. If you don't cook with meat, then it's fine. But if you do, you're likely to get pathogens like E. coli that could potentially contaminate your soil.
Got you. Okay.
Yep. I show off this not to really say like you can direct your laundry to landscape. Like that's a thing. Yes, you can do that. But also Brad put his out in a shed in his yard. He's in Tucson and it's not that cold of a climate. So the pipes won't freeze. And he lived in a neighborhood where a lot of people went to the laundromat and they walked multiple blocks carrying wet laundry back in particular to hang on the line. So they didn't have to pay to dry clothes at the laundromat. He was like, maybe my neighbors want to use my washing machine if I put it outside. And so he went to some of his neighbors and he said, hey, do you want to use my washing machine? And they're like, I don't want to go in your house. That's too disruptive. No, I don't. And he said, well, I'll move it outside in the yard. Would you go in the yard? And they were like, yeah, sure, that'd be great. Then I don't have to walk 4 extra blocks, you know. And what Brad got out, you know, that wasn't because he wanted to do good. It was because he wanted more fruit trees. He only did laundry 1 time a week, which is only enough water to support 1 tree. 3 of his other neighbors got in on it, and then he could grow 3 more trees, right? And so by bringing things together, by bringing his neighbors together, he's able to actually generate more abundance, more fruit, and he can share that fruit with his neighbors. And then you really start like building a community that way when you're sharing resources. That's awesome. That's sort of the main reason why I'm showing you this. This is the outlet of that washing machine. It's an open-ended pipe, and he can see both ends of this pipe, meaning he can be his own plumber. So his pipes aren't behind a wall. He can run a snake from this to the other end and clear a clog, right? He can do all the work himself because he can see both ends. This is just spilling into a mulch pit, and it's irrigating this fig tree and this prickly pear cactus that makes a delicious fruit here. And that's it. And this, back to this, he moves the pipe, the outflow of the washing machine, to a different tree on every single cycle. And it's clockwise. You can sort of barely tell that from the image, but his neighbors know that too. The main thing with gray water, especially with a laundry machine, is you have to use a soap that's biodegradable. You can't use Tide or Whisk or Downy, all that stuff that's actually fairly toxic. You need to use something a little more benign, like a biodegradable laundry detergent. I'll bring you a little bit to Earth Dance here as we wrap up. This is some of the design work or the initial assessment work we did for the parking grove. If you've been to Earth Dance, the parking area is really like right in here. This was the water flow that we documented across the site. It's sort of just kind of flowing sort of erratically and not, you know, with any necessary purpose. This is our little mock-up in our assessment of that water flow being a little more organized and used to produce things of food value or shade value or beauty or pollinator habitat or all of the above in one. This led to this, which is the aerial rendering of the parking lot. The water is really, the source of the water is really coming off of the high tunnels, which shed a lot of water. If you're looking to get into high tunnel production, you have to deal with the runoff. Like you can't afford not to do this. So just be aware of that any impervious surface is shedding a ton of water. So these high tunnels shed this water through this ditch, which crosses the road and goes under the parking entrance and through this ditch here, which is sort of reestablishing the natural stream course and irrigating all these trees. And this is more of a, I don't know, artistic bird's eye kind of rendering to show what it could look like. So this has been, the parking surface has been built. I don't think this has been built yet, or this, but we're dealing with the runoff. We've put the runoff back in contact with the soil, and we took the least valuable land there, because this tended to accumulate water. We put that in parking by raising it up and channeling the water around it, basically. This is my last slide, really. This is in Colorado, but this proves a really important point. I did a design for this house here. They hired me to basically take all their landscape off of irrigation. And I was able to do that, and I was able to show them that very easily it could be done to where they don't need to pay a high water bill to irrigate their landscape. And it's not a very big landscape. It's a pretty small landscape, in fact. And so they said, is this true for every house in this cul-de-sac? I said, I don't know, let's figure it out. So I calculated the roof surface, the street, and the driveways. That was it, as impervious surface, the amount, the surface that sheds water, doesn't absorb it. And then I looked at average usage in this community of water, and there's more water flowing off of these rooftops, this street, and these driveways than all of these houses use combined, outdoors and indoors, on an annual basis. Okay. So in this place where it's dry and where water scarcity is actually a really big issue, like a major issue, what this proves is that you can set up a development that just exists off rainfall and it doesn't need any water from anywhere else. Where I think this is particularly relevant in St. Louis is in redevelopment, particularly in places in North City or that have been hit hard by vacancy. If we're to redevelop those areas, we need to do it in a way that's pretty cost effective, and putting in a whole new sewer system in the laterals, which can be $10,000 a piece just from the street to the house. This removes all that, basically. So you design independent water systems for all these houses. Also means there's no water bill. That's awesome too. And you're growing a bunch of trees and you're producing food bills go down. The electric bills go down in the summer, especially because you got this treed landscape. It feels better. People are more comfortable, and it actually would allow us to redevelop areas that have been hit hard and in a way that's affordable and not financially prohibitive, which is really a main factor that goes into the lack of development that we see in places like North City and North County, or other communities that have been hit hard by vacancy. So we can design net zero water communities that don't need any water. They deal with their own waste. They manage their own water. They produce their own food. They produce their own shade. They reduce their own energy bills, right? They reduce the downstream pollution, so the dead zone isn't forming as bad, and the rivers get healthier, right? And the soil quality improves, and the trees grow faster, and the climate starts to improve because we're all sequestering more and more carbon. And before you know it, just by dealing with this one resource of water in a conscious and intelligent way, we solved a whole bunch of problems, right? And we didn't even try to solve the problems, right? It really wasn't even about problem solving. All of my work through permaculture really has nothing to do with solving problems, has everything to do with creating potential. And the potential is just valuing a resource that's falling free from the sky that we already don't value, that's been devalued. And look at all the abundance that's possible by doing that. So that's really like that's what I want to leave you with. Of look at what's possible. Like, look at all the potential that we could create by just valuing water, this one thing that's actually free from the sky. That's miraculous. I think that's game changing. I think when we do embrace that sort of role of ecosystem and resource caretaker, we dramatically start to get really different results as a society. So that's what I believe anyway, that's sort of what my work is about. And I really, really hope that some of y'all take up this work, because it's profoundly impactful. So thank you so much for listening. I know it's not easy sitting and staring at a screen, but I hope this was enriching for you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you find a spring or a body of water on most, I know not all, but mostly any plot of land or an acre of land and dig a well? Particularly
bigger pieces of land. And from a well perspective, most land can have a well dug underneath it. But you got to go, sometimes you got to go like 200 feet deep. you know, which requires a big machine to do it.
Gotcha. All right.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So with the net zero water communities, we know that this would make everything better. Why do you think it hasn't been embraced in St. Louis?
I think there's a lot of things holding St. Louis down. And one of them is really that it's education about this stuff. Like, again, we're never taught this stuff. We're taught to read, write, do math, learn a little bit of like bunk history, and we're never taught to make decisions in a conscious way. And I think once we start to do that, we get really dramatic results, and people are starting to take power into their own hands and meet needs, you know?
Yeah, I was even thinking too with the example about when you were talking about Arizona and the guy literally cut the curb. That would never fly in St. Louis. Although, well, my opinion. So although it was the right thing to do, he got in front of the right people. I mean, they realized, hey, this is what, you know, would definitely bring more diversity to wildlife and make things better, make things grow. But I'm not saying it can't happen, because I try to be optimistic, but it's like pulling teeth to try to get anything done that benefits, you know, anything that's ecological here. So
believe me, I know.
All space and time. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I've met with MSD, I've talked to them, and basically I've determined that they're doing this because the EPA says they have to. And it's not because they see these benefits. I wish they could. Maybe they haven't, you know, seen a presentation like this to talk about it. I don't know, you know, I think part of it is our business models. Like, the thing we tend to value is money, and we ignore all the wealth around us all the time. And that's just a paradigm thing. That's a paradigm shift that has to shift. And that's, when you do this work, you're part of that shift, right? You end up, you know, I have a number of friends that grow vacant lots across the street from their house, and suddenly they know their neighbors better, right? Suddenly they have like something to exchange with their neighbors, like in the form of food. And pretty quickly, like, you start to build community, and in a number of years, like, suddenly everybody is doing this stuff and generating wealth just from the land that's around and the resources that are devalued, just sitting there waiting to be tapped. I don't know that we changed the system through like policy and all of that. I haven't seen any evidence that that's the route to take. The only evidence that I've seen that creates a lot of change is when people take the responsibility and just do it and run with it. And sometimes that means asking for forgiveness after the fact if you're violating a law. I've cut curbs in St. Louis, mind you. I just want to say that. So.
Oh, okay. So we just go with like what's here. If a law is stupid, break it.
Yeah, where is that on here? There it is. Yeah. Really,
all right,
like,
thank you so much.
I'm a little bit of I've kind of always been a little bit of a lawbreaker, just because a lot of laws are done, you know, they're designed by people that weren't thinking either. So, you know,
I agree. Thank you.
Any other questions before we wrap things up, guys? All right, well, if there's nothing else, I just want to say thank you again so much, Jason, for presenting on water management. I'm sure everyone who was in attendance learned so much. There you go. We got the hand claps coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, awesome. One final announcement before you guys check out. Please, please, please don't forget to go into your email that had this link to do the feedback form. I'm sure Jason would love to hear what you thought about his presentation. And again, we use that information to consistently improve on our programming season after season. So with that being said, how about some high tens? And you guys have a wonderful evening.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. This is really awesome.
Loved it. That was incredible.
Great.
Where
All
do we
right.
get the recordings of these videos?
I can email them to you if you'd like. It's a pretty big download, but all it's recorded. The last 2 classes have been recorded.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Stay safe, y'all.
All right, you too. Wash your hands.
Will do. Bye-bye.
Bye.